Sometimes you have to see to believe and witness history as it unfolds. When the news is breaking, watch with the newsroom of The Washington Post. We explain what's happening and why it matters.
Thank you for choosing to watch the headlines as they're being written by our journalists. You can subscribe with a special offer at washingtonpost.com/watch. Subscribing through that link lets everyone here, from the front lines to the control room, know that you care about our continued efforts to inform the public,
protect the First Amendment, and foster a healthy democracy. We could not do this without you.
Directors of America's top intelligence agencies testify on worldwide threats today. They will appear before the House Intelligence Committee. Top of mind, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Russia's threat globally. You're looking at a live image of Kyiv, Ukraine's capital, where it is 4 o'clock in the afternoon. This is a special report from the newsroom of The Washington Post. I'm Libby Casey. Also this morning, President Biden will announce a ban on Russian oil imports in response to the invasion of Ukraine. We will bring you the president's remarks live when that happens around 10:45. But the morning starts with the House Intel Committee hearing on worldwide threats. And North Korea, Iran, cybercrime, domestic terrorism, all are fair game as House members question the heads of the FBI, CIA, NSA, and others. Of course, we're now in day 13 of Russia's attack on Ukraine and a shift in global relationships. So we'll preview today's hearing, and we'll also get the latest news from Ukraine over the next hour. Let's start on Capitol Hill with correspondent Rhonda Colvin. So, Rhonda, first of all, how significant is it to see these intelligence heads appear on Capitol Hill in public today?
It's very significant, Libby. It's significant because of the timing with the Ukraine conflict and that situation going on. This is a highly anticipated hearing. It happens every year, and it's a chance for the heads of all of our intelligence community. You mentioned the FBI, the CIA, the Director of National Intelligence. They will all be any of these House members who will be questioning these witnesses. It's also significant because it gives the public a chance to hear about what our intelligence community deems as a threat, what regions are concerning to them right now. Cyber attacks will likely be brought up. And if you look at some of the past hearings that this House Intelligence Committee has had on this subject, it usually does give you a forecast of what type of threats are coming. For instance, I looked at the transcript of last year's hearing, and Russia mobilizing troops around Ukraine, that was brought up last year. And of course, we know that's the situation that we're all looking at right now. Also in the 2019 report, it was mentioned that we and the world were not likely ready for any sort of strains of influenza that could turn into a pandemic. That was in 2019, so a full year before we knew about our first case of COVID-19. So this is a really important hearing that happens annually, once a year, and the basis of it is a report prepared by these agencies to deliver to Congress. And as I mentioned, later this week, the Senate counterpart of this committee will be hearing from these same witnesses as well. What we're expecting today is 2 hours of a public hearing and then 2 hours where these House members will be with these witnesses in a closed-door briefing.
So, Rhonda, you know, we'll all be listening so closely to hear about Russia and Ukraine, but where can this wander? I mean, what are you going to be listening for in addition to those topics? Where else can members of this committee go?
I think one of the number one things that we might hear in this hearing is concerns over cyber attacks. That's something that has been a part of the other reports from the last few years. Of course, it's concerning because many experts, both lawmakers as well as those in the Intelligence Committee, have wondered if we will get hit with a cyber attack. Is that perhaps the wave of next concern for Americans? So I suspect that these witnesses, given that they are the heads of our intelligence community, Committee will want to go over that. In past hearings, they've also discussed how foreign actors have tried to interfere in our elections. And, you know, we are in an election cycle, a very important one that will determine the power structures here on the Hill. So I would suspect that cyber attacks might be a significant part of this hearing. Also, you routinely hear some of the same countries mentioned in this report: North Korea, Russia, China, Iran. I would suspect those countries will also be brought up, and these lawmakers will be updated on some of those concerns related to those regions.
All right, thanks so much, Rhonda. We'll keep checking in with you throughout this morning. Let's go now to Isabel Kharkiv, who's in the Ukrainian port city of Odessa. And this is a city that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky had warned on Sunday that Russian forces were preparing to bomb. Isabel, it's so good to see you. Tell us about what the atmosphere is like in Odessa right now, how much fear and anticipation has been building up, and also how much preparation.
Yeah, well, I was just kind of out around the city myself, and today's International Women's Day, which is one of the bigger kind of holidays on the calendar here, and I was surprised to see about how many people were out and kind of buying flowers for the women in their lives, things of that sort. But the city, it almost looks like I would say a scene out of World War II. There's these metal barricades everywhere, sandbags. I saw one photo online that compared what the Opera House looks like now with the sandbags and these, metal hedgehogs kind of all around it, to a photo where it looked almost identical to World War II. There is a lot of preparation. They know an attack is going to come here because of how important the city is to Ukraine economically. It's one of the largest Black Sea ports, and there are Russian warships off the coast. Every now and again, you'll hear kind of a booming thud in the distance, and what it is the air defense system here working. And that also is a sign that Russia is testing the air defenses here. Right now, Russian troops are advancing on Mykolaiv, which is about 80 miles to the northeast rather. I think the expectation here is that if Mykolaiv falls, then Russian troops will advance from the east, and there will be an attempt to kind of attack from the sea itself.
So you talked about some of the infrastructure preparations, seeing the sort of the portrait of the city change. But what are average civilians doing? Are people choosing to leave or sort of hunker down? What choices do they have?
Yeah, I think, it's unique because unlike Kyiv and Kharkiv and other kind of major cities in Ukraine, there's been a lot of time to evacuate here. You've had 2 weeks or nearly 2 weeks where there hasn't been a lot of, shelling or anything like that here in Odessa. And the Moldovan and Romanian borders are very close to here. So if you wanted to evacuate, you had plenty of opportunity. Those borders, as far as crossing into them, are not as congested as the Polish border. However, a lot of people have chosen to stay. There's a really large territorial defense and military presence around the city. Everywhere you go, you see people kind of carrying guns, part of these various militias. And so, people talk about being from Odessa as kind of a separate nationality. Yes, you're Ukrainian, but people from Odessa, people who live in Odessa, have a special kind of love for this city. And so I think a lot of people have chosen to stay here. There's also a large elderly population here that isn't leaving, not only because maybe they don't want to, but also because it's kind of impractical for a lot of them. It's just hard to get on these trains and kind of be mobile enough to evacuate. So there is quite a bit of people still left in the city, and I think they are just kind of hunkering down and anticipating an attack to come, but using this time to prepare for it.
Isabel, one of those people who's chosen to stay is your great aunt. Please tell us more about your family connection to Odessa.
Yeah, so I'm the first person in my family who was born in the United States. Both my parents and their parents were all born in Odessa. They immigrated a long time ago in 1978, but my great aunt Zena, my grandfather's older sister, who was kind of a nanny for me when I was a kid. She actually taught me how to speak Russian, which is a pretty useful skill these days. She's here, she's staying. I asked her why she won't leave. And she, told me about how she went to the United States 4 different times. Her, siblings all moved there, but she came back every single time to Odessa. That, this city is really special to her. It's like home. There's a saying here, it's called Odessa Mama, which really kind of captures the feeling that this city is your mother, and so your mother will take care of you.
So this was your grandfather's sister, and she's been showing you around the city, and you were trying to go back and see where your grandparents had lived, but you weren't able to. Talk to us about sort of just navigating the city with your great aunt and what you're able to do and not able to do.
Yeah, it's weird. I never thought I would come here under these circumstances. Obviously, it's been quite difficult because just the fact that I'm here right now in the middle of a war is kind of an indication that, I'm expecting something to happen here, which is devastating because, I have my own kind of personal love for this city. And so to see it like this for the first time is quite strange. But yeah, a lot of streets are blockaded or closed. We tried to get to the street where, my father grew up in as a baby, and we were stopped by, territorial defense soldiers who were like, I'm sorry, you can't go through there. There's defensive operations going on. Even today we had to get kind of a military escort to just get close to the Opera House because it's so guarded. And there's a lot of barricades around it. So really kind of all of the downtown streets that are usually really lively with cafes and civilian walkways and, just has this like very European feel to it. Those streets are closed or they're covered with soldiers or metal barricades, and it kind of looks unrecognizable. I mean, 7 p.m. curfew here. So it's a very warlike atmosphere right now. People are kind of getting used to it, but it is a little strange, especially for, the people who are used to kind of the nightlife, the clubs, and sort of a different feel to the city.
Well, Isabel Khurshidyan, thank you so much, and thank you for all your reporting. You can read Isabel's story about her personal connection to Odessa, as well as all of her comprehensive reporting on our website. Thanks a lot, Isabel. We'll hopefully talk to you again soon.
Thank you.
Let's bring in James Homan. So, James, this is day 13 of the Russian invasion. Can you talk to us about what's happening on the ground? And maybe while you're there at the map also, point out where Odessa is to us and why this has been seen as a really key city.
Yeah, absolutely, Libby. Isabel was just talking to us from down here on Odessa, and she also mentioned Mykolaiv, which is right now Russian dominated. You can see there's a river dividing them. Ukraine has been weakest in its southern belly. Part of that is because Russia has controlled Crimea since 2014, and the Donetsk and Luhansk regions over here have been under Russian control. So they were able to move in. There's quite a large Russian naval presence in the Black Sea. Isabel mentioned that the Russian subs and ships are testing the air defenses of Odessa. The Russians miscalculated here in the southern part of the country because they expected to be greeted as liberators and not as occupiers. And in a city like Mykolaiv, we've seen large protests, people waving Ukrainian flags, sort of a revived Ukrainian patriotism and opposition to Russian advances. So Odessa is one of the biggest prizes. And when you talk to people at the Pentagon before this war started 2 weeks ago, they thought that Putin would move into Odessa first, that there's a very strategic port here. And this is a lot of the most prosperous agriculture regions of the country are up here. Grain goes through the Odessa port, and there's a major airport. Right now, the Ukrainians still control those. The Odessa mayor was seen as someone who was allied with Russia, but instead he has really embraced the cause of defending his city. So the Russians do control this area in pink here, including the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, which is right here on the river, the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. Russians now control that after shelling it last week. Ukrainians are still operating the plant, but they're literally doing so at gunpoint. The two biggest cities in the country, Libya, are to the north. Obviously, Kyiv up here is the biggest prize, and we'll talk in a few minutes about that. And Kharkiv continues to be shelled today. It's in the 4 o'clock hour now. And this is the second biggest city in the country. There's about 1.5 million people. And meanwhile, the West remains under Ukrainian control. So this area is where a lot of the fighting is taking place, and up here as well.
Yeah, James, you pointed out that power plant. We can see the icons of other nuclear power plants throughout Ukraine. Let's talk about their strategic importance as well as, the importance that they're powering the country.
Yeah, exactly. They're working power plants, and millions of people. Just for context, Ukraine is the size of Texas. From here to the west is going from New York City to Chicago. There's about 40 million people who were living there before the invasion, and they really do depend on these nuclear power plants. And so Zaporizhia powers quite a lot of this region. A lot of these folks are without power. There has been some concern that the Russians could essentially use this to extort some of this area of the country that depends on power by threatening to shut off power or even, blow up parts of the plant. There would be massive fallout over here. Ultimately, because Russians are confident that they're going to occupy and control the country, they have an incentive right now to protect these nuclear power plants and to keep them online. But you can see that there's another major plant right here that would potentially be part of any advance toward Odessa. These are strategic targets. Obviously, it's quite scary when anyone is shelling a nuclear power plant. We really did get lucky that there was not fallout from the Zaporizhia plant. It's a different kind of power plant than up here, which is the famous Chernobyl incident from 1986. That plant not online, but obviously the fallout from Chernobyl affected all of Europe. There were clouds of radioactive dust above Oslo in Norway in the 80s, and there are two plants here. In the western part of the country, in the more European aligned part of the country, and they really are providing lots of power for this half of the country. And Kyiv itself relies a little less on nuclear power than some other places because it's right on the Dnieper River, the major river that divides the country. And so there are dams along the Dnieper River that provides most of the power for Kyiv.
James, let's talk about what else is happening this morning. In addition to this hearing that we'll be broadcasting on worldwide threats, we also anticipate hearing from President Biden, and he'll announce that the United States is banning the imports of Russian oil. This is, of course, response to the invasion of Ukraine, and that's scheduled to be at about 10:45. So, James, that move could trigger a spike in already high gas prices. Tell us more about the president's calculation and decision.
Well, we'll see what it does to the markets. The White House feels, a senior administration official I talked to, that this is already sort of priced in. Pressure has been building for days in a bipartisan way from Capitol Hill. And frankly, the United States itself does not import that much oil from Russia. Most of it goes to Hawaii, interestingly enough, because of its proximity in the Pacific to Russia, relatively speaking. Yesterday, oil prices went as high as $139 a barrel, and they fell back down to $120 a barrel by the end of trading. And that was because the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, announced that Germany is very unlikely to ban Russian oil imports. That would push their country into a deep recession. They already canceled the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, but they're still getting quite a lot of energy through the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. And so the markets the price of oil came back down because Germany canceling Russia imports would be a big deal. Right now, there are lots of oil tankers on the high seas with Russian oil that are kind of not sure where they're going to go. There's a lot of thinking at the White House that ultimately China and India will end up buying this Russian oil. But so there's been a lot of behind the scenes maneuvering over the weekend. The United States has been trying really hard to make sure that Europe will get the energy it needs, even if Russia chooses to cut off Europe. The Biden White House sent a delegation down to meet with Venezuelan leaders on Saturday to talk about potentially relaxing sanctions there. There are conversations with the Canadians, and most significantly, there are conversations with Saudi Arabia. If the Saudis increased production significantly, that would bring prices down. So far, the Saudis have resisted. And so basically, this isn't terribly surprising. What's surprising is that it took Biden a couple days more to get to this position. White House folks say they've been working behind the scenes to make sure that this isn't going to cause disruptions, especially for Hawaii, which depends on Russian oil, making sure that there's going to be alternative sources to get there. Still, it's another significant move by the administration to show that the U.S. is taking this invasion seriously and is retaliating accordingly.
Thanks so much, James. Let's bring Rhonda Colvin back into this conversation. You know, Rhonda, so much of the direction of the questions that we're likely to hear from House Intel Committee members is sort of changing and evolving as the news is changing and evolving. So let's talk through what you'll be listening for in relation to Ukraine specifically, and both intelligence, but also sort of feeling out some of the options that the Biden administration and Congress might have.
Yeah, well, this hearing will likely be sort of an information gathering event for these lawmakers, both the public session and the closed-door session that they will go in 2 hours later. I will, again, be listening to what they have to say about cyber attacks. That's really something that is weighing on the minds of many Americans, wondering if our financial institutions are safe, wondering if our food systems and grocery stores are safe from any sort of cyber attack. So I would assume that that is going to be brought up by some of these lawmakers on this committee. Many of these committee members also sit on committees that have similar jurisdiction over issues of foreign affairs, armed services, and intelligence. So it's likely that they will be asking some informed questions, but they also will want to hear from these members of our intelligence community. I will also be listening out about global health. That's been a part for the last few years, has been a part of this unclassified report from the Intelligence Committee, discussing COVID, discussing how we are protected from other pandemics or other strains that could be coming. So that also is a part of what I'll be listening to today as well.
Great, thanks, Rhonda. Karin Demerjen joins us now. She covers Congress and national security for The Post. So, Karin, first let's set up the basics here. You know, so much was baked into this hearing that happened before the last 13 days and this invasion of Ukraine. But House members, of course, can go anywhere with their questions, and they're very aware of the news, and they're grappling with questions about how much these intel heads, these intelligence leaders, can say publicly about Putin, about what's happening in Ukraine. So, talk to us first about what you'll be listening for in terms of the Ukraine threads with the House Intel Committee.
Well, look, I mean, they are going to probably not be giving the most juiciest bits in the open door session, right? Because it would be great if we could listen for the details of exactly where things are on the ground, of what weapons we're planning to supply. If this deal with planes getting MiGs to the Ukrainians, which would give them more firepower with which to try to assert control over their airspace vis-a-vis the Russians, then that would be very, very revelatory. But I'm very doubtful that we will hear those sorts of details. So I guess what I'm listening for the most to kind of expand our understanding of where this is all going is just the spillover effects of all of this. We are suddenly handling what everybody's afraid of turning into World War III, and yet we have to juggle a lot of things at the same time. So there are questions, as Rhonda pointed out, questions about cyber attacks are one, right? Another question that I have is just about what does this do vis-a-vis, what we are seeing with just general global oil markets and what sort of stability that creates or instability that creates in other parts of the world. What is China thinking watching this, and does that change China's approach to certain other parts of its sphere of influence? There's always a question about what is China going to do with Taiwan? Well, our reaction to what Russia does in Ukraine could send certain signals to other major powers that also have problematic behavior towards their less strong neighbors. I'm also wondering if anybody's going to ask questions about, food security and what sort of spillover and in terms of traditional national security concerns that could cause, because you're talking about Ukraine and Russia together, which are a little distracted right now, 25% of the world's wheat supply, over half of the world's sunflower oil, various things that are kind of staples that get exported to around the world, that is now going to send the price of food, not just in this country up, but in places in the world that are really dependent on there being enough of a supply in the global economy to meet the demands of places that are not able to produce their own. So all of these questions are things I'm listening for. I'm listening to see if there's going to be any discussion of, countries that have been dependent on Russia or accommodating of Russia, potentially changing their calculus right now. That could be fairly pivotal in areas like Central Asia, where we've been trying to get a better foothold because of our departure from Afghanistan. So it's a web. Everything is interconnected. And though I don't assume that we're going to get radically new details on Ukraine specifically, the territory of Ukraine right now and what's going on there in the open session, it depends on what questions people ask. We could get some interesting takes on how this is all potentially radiating and may continue to radiate even after, if the fighting dies down, I guess, in Ukraine.
Karin, what opportunity does a public hearing offer, both for House members, but also for these heads of intelligence agencies? Because they have the opportunity now not just to talk to the American public, but also to talk to the global community and do it in this public setting as opposed to behind those closed doors. When everyone is listening, could they use this opportunity to send some signals?
Yeah, I mean, they certainly could. It's a rare opportunity in which the intelligence chiefs are actually not really communicating directly with members of Congress, because they do that all the time, but communicating directly with the American public, which is a very rare occasion. And so you've seen, in the past, when the intelligence community wants to make a statement of its assertions as compared to the diplomatic community, the president, et cetera, these hearings can become a real moment for that. We saw that especially during the Trump administration, when there was this question of, Russian interference, not Russian interference in the election. You don't have those sorts of tensions right now between the intelligence community and the White House the way that you used to. But, there's some people that are going to be on this dais that have some fairly unique experience. I mean, the CIA director used to be ambassador to Russia, right? And so you've got insights here that are not just that are not just limited to kind of reading the signals right now, which is of course very important, but actually could be able to provide some contextualization to that too, which would be important for the public's understanding of this, because that has been a constant challenge for all parts of the administration, to communicate to the country why it is that they need to be caring about this and how it's maybe not just about this country in Ukraine, which has gained quite the stature in the United States over the last several years due to various fits and starts of crises surrounding Ukraine. But that it's not just about this one particular territory on Europe's eastern flank, that it is potentially relevant in other ways, and what people should expect for that going forward. So it's a different set of voices, and voices that are really, really steeped in these matters to be projecting this message, which I think will expand upon what the administration has been saying, not really be in conflict.
James Hohmann, let's talk about this web that Karin's laying out for us, these interwoven global threats and challenges as these intel chiefs see them. How significant is it that this is an opportunity to make some of those global connections?
Yeah, Libby, it's amazing the spillovers that you sometimes don't anticipate, the unintended consequences of this decision by Putin. It feels so far away, but there's all these little things. Obviously, Karun talked about the potential supply shocks. Even a company like Boeing, it turns out, gets its titanium from a Russian company that's controlled by a Russian oligarch, and that is going to have an impact on the economy in the Seattle area. The Sri Lankan economy, its biggest source of tourists is Russia. And Russians can no longer go visit Sri Lanka. So the Sri Lanka economy is likely to enter a depression. What kind of political impact is that going to have on that country? That is probably too in the weeds for this 2-hour hearing, but it's a kind of a vignette of how a lot of these problems can have multiplier effects. Higher gas prices may cause people to travel less, which could affect hotels here in the United States and result in hospitality workers who've just gotten hired again after the pandemic is sort of coming to an end, causing them to lose their jobs again. So we are very much part of an interconnected world, and this is all happening against the backdrop of the biggest humanitarian crisis since World War II in Europe. Already the numbers that we're seeing of refugees, for example, are higher than the number of Syrians we saw back in 2015. And you'll recall what a political crisis that was on the European continent. It frankly led to, helped spur Brexit and helped spur the rise of a lot of far-right nationalists. And here, we're having a hard time keeping up, Libby. The numbers are so large. Ukraine, again, a country of 40 million people. We made this graphic earlier this morning, and it shows more than 1.8 million refugees from Ukraine. The United Nations in the last 10 minutes has just said the number is now over 2 million. More than half the refugees are going to Poland. 1 million people have entered Poland in the last 2 weeks from Ukraine. These are people who are often coming with just the clothes on their back and maybe a backpack. There are massive backlogs. The roads are backed up with people trying to cross over. The images of trains full to the gills, thousands of people waiting in train stations, all hoping to go west. So most are going to Poland. More than 100,000 have gone to Slovakia and Hungary, Romania, Moldova. As we heard from Isabel a few minutes ago, people aren't really evacuating from Odessa. When they do, which is likely when there's a Russian attack from the east or an amphibious landing, you'll see the numbers go up pretty dramatically. And in fact, the UN saying this morning, Libby, that they expect in the next 10 days, the number of refugees from Ukraine will pass 4 million. Just dramatic numbers, and it's going to be hard. Countries are being very welcoming right now. It's hard to kind of bring 4 million people into Europe. And how many refugees will the United States take is an open question. So these are the kinds of things that could then have massive effects on Poland and its politics and its economy, and in ways that we can't even really begin to imagine, third, fourth order effects. And that's where the US intelligence community is pretty good at trying to think through and grapple with if this, then that.
Karin, let's talk about the humanitarian corridors. As we look at that map that James just laid out for us of where refugees are going and just the massive amounts of numbers, there is a real concern, Karin, about Russia allowing people to escape some of the cities under siege. What is your latest reporting on that?
Yeah, well, we've been hearing from Pentagon sources that, civilians are being hit as they're trying to flee. Now, they're not going so far as to saying civilians are being targeted as they are trying to flee, but they are being hit. And, we've seen images of the result of that, too. And so this is, look, the ceasefire has not been that durable as it appears on the ground. Clearly, the fighting has continued in very many areas of the country. And this idea of a humanitarian corridor is nice, but if it's not actually being realized, then that just says that the stakes of where people, the stakes that people are facing as they make the decision of whether or not to flee is still just as high as it ever was. And the numbers are staggering of the refugee count and the spillover effect in Europe. Remember, wherever you see a refugee count, you usually have as equal or greater numbers of people who are already internally displaced within the country, which means maybe that's not a problem for Europe yet because they're still in Ukraine. But if you've left your home, you've left your community, you are on the road, you are trying to make it to a border, you're not exactly in a stable situation either in the meantime. And this is just like global truth, that it's an undercount usually of the people that are displaced from their homes and within the country until they cross that border and are counted by a UN agency. So that's significant as well.
You've been covering these talks between Russia and Ukrainian officials. What can you tell us about how they've been going?
Well, we've seen them go for several rounds at this point, which means they're still going. But the question really is, are these demands coming anywhere within the realm of something that they could meet? It does not appear that Russia yet is willing to kind of accept an armed Ukraine, a Ukraine that wants to be looking westward, all the things that Ukraine has kind of staked its whole identity on over the last decade. And Ukraine is not interested in effectively becoming a vassal state or watching itself get carved up, which, in Russia diplomatically already has, because they recognized the two separatist controlled Eastern republics as separate states. So there is a real impasse here. And, as long as the bombardment continues, and remember, we're actually seeing, as much as the diplomatic talks are ongoing, we're seeing intensified bombardments of these population centers. Yes, the Ukrainians have managed to hold back things like the convoy, hold back these Russian supply lines and advances on the ground. But the Russians have moved from using a majority of short-range missiles to long-range missiles to try to hit the cities from further away. And that means that they are, that they are continuing the pressure and upping the pressure, frankly, on all of these major areas, even as we're seeing these diplomatic talks go. Now that can sometimes be a tactic to try to squeeze your opponent to making concessions they would not otherwise make. But I have not yet seen the Ukrainians say, okay, fine, too many people have died, we're willing to fold our cards here. That's not the spirit that they're projecting. And Putin has not been projecting the idea of, we were saying all along that if he got into this fight, it was going to be really difficult for him to get out of the fight because he needs a win. And there's not an obvious win here. And the sanctions keep coming and the economic measures keep coming. And yes, you can scale those back once you've put them out. We can always say, all right, fine, we'll start buying Russian oil again, or we'll lift your central bank sanctions. But we can't say that unless we see a real first concession from Putin. And he's not been in that sort of a mood. So it's good that the talks are ongoing, but I don't know that I can actually tell you that I've seen progress that leads us to be hopeful that this isn't going to be, grinding in for a long haul.
Karin Demerjen, thank you so much. Really appreciate all of your insights. We can see there an image of where the Intel Committee will be meeting soon. That's inside the Rayburn House office building. And we will be seeing testimony from the top Intel chiefs in this country. I want to bring Rhonda Colvin in to talk about what Congress can do right now, Rhonda. As we hear reporting that President Biden will be speaking later, talking about banning Russian oil imports, as we hear Karin catalog and go through what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, what can Congress do?
Well, there hasn't been a lot of big legislation related to Ukraine just yet, but I think by the end of this week that could be different. I know there has been a lot of talk and loud calls for this ban on Russian oil imports, and that's something that the Speaker of the House over the weekend told Democratic lawmakers in the House that she wanted to put legislation related to that on the floor up for a vote. And then yesterday there was a lot of discussion between both chambers, the House and the Senate, about a legislative package that would ban Russian oil imports. It also goes further, where it gives the executive branch more power to enhance tariffs and on Russia, and it will also block Russia from joining the World Trade Organization. So it does go a step further. We're of course waiting for the Biden administration to tell us what their plans are on that ban, but there is legislation that would cover different elements of the situation. There is also an aid package in the works. That's something that we spoke to Senator Chris Coons from Delaware in the Senate last week, and he told us that he was confident that something would come about around $10 billion. And it looks like now that it could be $12 billion. The White House asked for about $10 billion. Now senators think that they can get even more money. That would include money for weapons, assistance for Ukraine, as well as some of the other countries in that region. It would also give some support to the Treasury Department to enforce these sanctions. So there's a lot of momentum, I would say, on Capitol Hill, and it's moving pretty fast. And it is also bipartisan and bicameral, where you have both chambers discussing what they want to do for Ukraine. So it looks like by the end of this week, we will see some sort of movement on both of those issues.
All right, Rhonda, thank you. Well, as violence in Ukraine continues to escalate, the human toll mounts as well. On Saturday, a suspected Russian rocket hit a residential area in Bila Surka, a town 50 miles south of Kyiv. 15-year-old Anna was at home when the blast hit, and our colleague, Washington Post video journalist John Gerberg, met her and has this story.
Коли це сталося, я була в ліжку, я тільки прокинулась, і я бачила дуже білий світ скрізь. Я чула, як падають обламки, і відразу почала кричати своїм близьким, чи з ними все добре. З однієї сторони це все жахливо, але я рада, що всі живі, і з усіма все добре. Також тут ще живе мій кіт, якого ще досі не вдалося знайти, Це я дуже сильно переживаю. Я отримала декілька поранень, але вони не дуже сильні. Це просто подряпини від осколок і якийсь шоковий стан, але я думаю, все буде добре і це все можна відбудувати. Нема ніякого, я не знаю, нічого немає. Тут просто це жилі дома, це біля річки, тут гуляють люди, це таке більш красиве місце, аніж якесь воєнне. Наші військові дуже добре працюють, вони справді дуже стараються і допомагають всім, чим можуть. І це дуже важливо, це підтримка нашої країни. Для інших людей, для інших країн, які думають, які говорять неправду, на нас дійсно нападають, і не на просто воєнні об'єкти, а на звичайних людей. Це жахливо, і Я навіть не знаю, як можна вірити чомусь іншому.
A piece filed by our colleague John Gerberg profiling a 15-year-old Anna in Ukraine. Let's bring John Hudson into the conversation, national security reporter focusing on the State Department and diplomacy. You know, John, this war is unfolding with real-time images, real-time stories, thanks to our colleagues who are reporting from there, as well as because of social media. How influential is the connection that people all over the world are feeling with Ukrainians, including the Ukrainian president right now, as he shares his own story in interviews and over social media? How much is that changing how top diplomats are responding to Ukraine?
I think it's having a massive impact, thanks to our reporters on the ground, John Gerberg and so many others who are doing such a great job at making those images and seeing and tracking the toll of the humanitarian devastation going on. It's being beamed into people's homes everywhere and into their phones and onto their television sets. And it really has created a lot of public outcry about what more the West can do to help Ukrainian people as their cities are demolished and their homes are destroyed and their family members are killed. Right now, I think as a result, just look at this morning, the administration's move to ban Russian gas and oil imports. That is something that the administration initially said it was going to rule out. It said it's going to look very closely at protecting Americans at the gas pump. That was a priority, but because some of these images, like we just saw, have been coming out, it's really created a rallying call by populations in the United States, also in Europe, to do more. And this is the next step, really willing to see government officials doing more to punish Russia than they had ever promised, even if it's going to hurt Americans at the gas pump and potentially hurt the administration politically, given how important gas prices are in terms of shaping moods ahead of the midterm elections.
What can you tell us about Secretary of State Antony Blinken's diplomatic efforts over the past few days? Catch us up on the latest.